Marcus had always been the quiet one in class. He kept his head down, focused on his work, and avoided drawing attention to himself. But today was different. Today, something would happen that would change everything. It started just like any other day. The bell rang, signaling the beginning of third period. Students filed into the classroom, chatting and laughing with one another. Marcus, as usual, slid into his seat near the back, pulling out his notebook and waiting for the class to start. He wasn't looking for trouble. He didn't need the spotlight. All he wanted was to get through the day unnoticed. Mr. Thompson, the teacher, stood at the front of the classroom, scribbling something on the whiteboard. He was the kind of teacher who liked to make his presence known. He had a booming voice and a sharp sense of humor that, more often than not, ended up with students as the butt of his jokes. Marcus had learned to tune out Mr. Thompson's comments. It wasn't that he hated the teacher, but he knew what was coming. It was always the same. The mocking, the jokes, the comments about his background. He could already feel the sting of the teacher's eyes scanning the room, looking for someone to pick on. Marcus just hoped it wouldn't be him today. "All right, class," Mr. Thompson boomed, snapping Marcus out of his thoughts. "Today we're going to start with a quick review of the material from last week's lesson. I'm sure you all remember the quadratic equations, right?" Marcus had been working through the equations in his head the night before, but his hand still trembled slightly as he picked up his pencil. He hated being called on, but it was almost inevitable. Mr. Thompson always liked to pick on the students who were quiet, who never answered back. Mr. Thompson's gaze swept over the room before landing on Marcus. A mischievous smile crept onto his face. "How about you, Marcus?" Mr. Thompson said with exaggerated enthusiasm. "You look like you've got this down, don't you? Come on, solve this one for us." The class turned to look at Marcus. He felt his stomach twist. Everyone was waiting. The pressure was unbearable. He could feel their eyes boring into him, waiting for him to mess up, to fail. Marcus glanced at the board. The quadratic equation was staring back at him, mocking him. He knew the answer. He'd solved these types of problems 100 times in his head, but now, with all eyes on him, his mind went blank. The numbers on the board seemed to swim in front of his eyes. The simple equation had suddenly become a mountain too steep to climb. "Come on, Marcus," Mr. Thompson said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't tell me you're stuck already. I thought you were supposed to be the genius in the back row. Or did you forget how to do basic math?" A few students snickered. Some of them glanced at each other, clearly enjoying the awkwardness. Marcus could feel his face flushing, his hands clammy as he struggled to keep his composure. He was always the quiet one, the one who stayed out of the limelight. But now, Mr. Thompson had put him on the spot, and there was no way out. The teasing had started subtly in previous weeks. Little jabs about Marcus being too quiet or too serious. But today was different. The teacher's words stung like a slap. He knew Mr. Thompson wasn't just asking a question. He was trying to humiliate him in front of the class. Marcus opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The pressure in the room was suffocating. He couldn't breathe. The students were watching, waiting for him to fail. He hated this feeling. It wasn't just the ridicule that hurt. It was the sense that no matter how hard he tried, no one saw him for what he really was. They saw a kid who didn't belong, a kid who wasn't smart enough to keep up with the others. He could hear Mr. Thompson's voice again, more mocking than before. "Don't worry, Marcus. We'll all wait while you figure it out. Maybe you need a little help, huh?" The laughter from a few students rang in his ears. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, all he wanted to do was disappear. He felt small, insignificant. Just one more face in the crowd, easily ignored and dismissed. But then, something inside him snapped. Marcus wasn't sure what changed in that moment, but he could feel a fire beginning to build. It was a strange feeling, something he hadn't experienced before. The humiliation, the mockery, it didn't matter anymore. His mind cleared, and his hand gripped the pencil with a new resolve. Without thinking, Marcus stood up. The class went silent. Everyone stared at him in disbelief. "I can solve it," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, though there was a new strength in it. Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Oh. Really? Well, go ahead then. Show us all how it's done." Marcus took a deep breath. The words flowed from him now, each calculation falling into place like pieces of a puzzle. The numbers on the board suddenly made sense again. He could feel the tension in the room shifting. The mocking smiles started to fade, replaced with a confused silence. His fingers moved quickly, writing out the solution step by step. When he finished, he stepped back, looking at the board. The equation was solved, perfectly. The classroom was still. Mr. Thompson stared at the board, a hint of surprise flickering across his face. He blinked, then looked at Marcus. For the first time, there was a crack in the teacher's usually confident demeanor. "Well," Mr. Thompson said after a long pause, "I'll be damned. You really did it." The class was silent for a moment longer before the bell rang, signaling the end of the period. But the damage had been done. Marcus didn't wait for anyone's approval. He grabbed his things and left the room, his heart racing, but for the first time, it wasn't from fear. It was from something else, a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. As he walked out into the hallway, he couldn't help but smile to himself. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't invisible anymore. But what happened next would be far more than he could have ever anticipated. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Marcus had always been different. Not in the sense of having some extraordinary ability that set him apart from everyone else, but in the way he saw the world. Where others might have seen a problem and become frustrated, Marcus had a quiet determination that made him dig deeper, search for answers that others missed. Growing up, this didn't always serve him well. People around him didn't always understand. He was born into a family that had seen its share of hardships. His mother, Diane, was a nurse who worked long hours at the local hospital, and his father, who had left when Marcus was only 5, had never been part of the picture. Diane had done her best to provide for Marcus and his younger sister, Jada, but money was tight. Still, his mother never let it affect how she treated them. She was warm, caring, and always found a way to make their home feel like a safe haven, no matter what was happening outside their door. When Marcus was younger, he would often hear his mother say, "You can be anything, Marcus, but you've got to work hard. Don't let anyone tell you you're not good enough. Because you are." Those words stayed with him, even as he entered high school. But it didn't make it any easier when he was constantly looked down on by his peers and even some teachers. Marcus had always been a straight-A student, but it wasn't always enough to change people's perceptions of him. The way he carried himself, the quiet way he observed everything, rather than being outspoken or loud like some of his classmates, made him an easy target. In class, Marcus was often dismissed as being too serious. His clothes weren't as stylish as the other students, and his social circle was small, consisting mostly of Jamal, his best friend since elementary school. Jamal was the kind of person who had no problem speaking up, the kind who would make sure that everyone knew who he was, whether they wanted to or not. He had always been there for Marcus, no matter what. "Man, you're way smarter than these people give you credit for," Jamal would often say to Marcus after school. "Don't let them mess with you. We both know the truth, right?" Marcus would always smile in response, appreciating Jamal's constant support. But even Jamal knew that sometimes, it was hard for Marcus to fight against the way people saw him. And it wasn't just the kids in his class. It was teachers, too. People who should have been his allies were often just as dismissive. Marcus's experience with Mr. Thompson was the latest in a long line of instances where he'd been judged unfairly. It wasn't that he was afraid of failing, he didn't mind working hard. But there was a part of him, deep down, that wished someone would take the time to see beyond the quiet kid in the back row. He wasn't just a shy, nerdy student. He was someone with potential. He just needed the right environment to thrive. The hardest part was that Marcus couldn't really talk about it to his mom. Diane worked so hard to provide for their family, and Marcus didn't want to burden her with the struggles he faced at school. She already had enough to deal with. And as much as he loved Jada, she was too young to really understand the weight he carried. So he kept it to himself, trying to navigate the world without letting it affect his self-worth. But there was something else driving Marcus, something that neither his classmates nor his teachers had any idea about. While most kids spent their free time playing video games or hanging out, Marcus spent his hours buried in books, diving deep into subjects that fascinated him. It wasn't just the textbook material, he loved to challenge himself. The math problems, the science experiments, the intricate puzzles that no one else seemed interested in, those were the things that kept him going. He'd stay up late into the night, reading articles on quantum physics or watching educational videos about advanced mathematics, all the while knowing he was developing a mind that could rival anyone. Jamal knew about Marcus's passion for learning. He was the one who always saw Marcus's potential, even when others didn't. Jamal would often joke, "You're gonna be the one to invent something big one day, man. You just wait." But Marcus wasn't the type to get ahead of himself. He didn't want to be famous. He just wanted to prove to himself that he could achieve something that no one else thought possible. As much as Marcus tried to focus on his studies and ignore the negativity around him, there was one thing that kept eating away at him, the constant feeling of being underestimated. It wasn't just Mr. Thompson's mocking that cut deep. It was the way people always assumed that because he was quiet, or because he came from a less-than privileged background, he couldn't possibly be intelligent. They didn't see the hours of work he put in behind the scenes. They didn't know about the late nights spent doing math problems, or the countless books stacked up in his room. They didn't understand that he had a mind that was capable of far more than they gave him credit for. He could hear his mother's voice in his head, urging him to keep going, to stay focused on what really mattered. "You are enough, Marcus. Don't let them convince you otherwise." But sometimes, it was hard to believe it. It was hard to see the potential in himself when no one else did. As Marcus sat in class, his mind wandered back to the equation Mr. Thompson had asked him to solve earlier. The numbers kept replaying in his mind, and a strange feeling washed over him. He wasn't just good at math, he had a gift. The kind of gift that couldn't be seen by simply glancing at a report card or listening to a teacher's opinion. This was something deeper. Something more profound. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt something stir inside him. It wasn't just the desire to prove his teacher wrong. It was a burning need to show the world who he really was. And that moment, when Mr. Thompson had doubted him, when the rest of the class had laughed, was the moment everything would change. Because Marcus was about to show everyone, including himself, just how much he was capable of. The next few days after Marcus's impromptu math lesson with Mr. Thompson felt like they happened in a blur. News of Marcus's unexpected brilliance spread like wildfire throughout the school. Whispers filled the hallways. Students looked at him with a mixture of awe and curiosity. It was a strange feeling for Marcus. He had always been the one to slip under the radar, but now, it seemed like everyone was watching him. Some of them were impressed, while others were skeptical, and a few even mocked him in the halls. But no one had expected the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. It all started the following Monday during lunch. Marcus sat at his usual spot, tucked away in the corner of the cafeteria, with Jamal beside him. Jamal had always been Marcus's pillar of support, and today, he seemed more excited than usual. Man, I heard the math teacher's got a bet going with some of the senior class, Jamal said between bites of his sandwich. He's betting you can't solve a problem in front of the whole school. He wants to see if you really have what it takes to back up what you did in class. Marcus's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and unease flooding him. What? He's serious about that? Jamal shrugged, clearly amused. Apparently. Word's gotten out about what happened. People are talking. And you know how Mr. Thompson likes to make everything into a competition. He probably just wants to see if you can walk the walk now. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He didn't want to be part of some public spectacle. He had barely managed to survive the first encounter with Mr. Thompson, and now it seemed like the teacher wanted to make him the centerpiece of some kind of twisted game. But Jamal was quick to reassure him. Don't sweat it, man. You're smart. You'll blow everyone away again. Besides, you've got this. He patted Marcus on the back as if to pump him up. Marcus didn't share Jamal's enthusiasm. What started as a single, small victory now felt like a ticking time bomb. There was no way to avoid the upcoming challenge. He could already feel the pressure building inside him. If he refused, he would be branded as a coward. If he accepted, he would risk failure on a public stage, with everyone watching. Either way, he was in a lose-lose situation. Later that afternoon, Marcus received an email from Mr. Thompson. The subject line read, "The challenge, are you up for it?" The email was brief, but its message was clear: Marcus had been selected for the challenge. In front of the entire school, Marcus would solve a series of difficult math problems in real time. No more hiding in the back row. This was his chance to prove he wasn't just a fluke. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. The school gymnasium. We'll see if you can back up what you did last week. Bring your best. Marcus stared at the screen for a long moment, his fingers frozen over the keyboard. He didn't want to do it. The thought of being publicly humiliated again was almost unbearable. But at the same time, a small part of him knew he couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. Mom's gonna kill me if I mess up, he muttered to himself, though deep down, he knew this wasn't just about her. It was about proving to himself, and to everyone else, that he wasn't some shy, overlooked kid. He had a gift. It was time to show it off. As he walked to school the next morning, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of dread gnawing at his insides. The challenge wasn't just a test of his math skills, it felt like a test of everything he was. His worth. His place in the world. Everything hinged on this one event. By the time Marcus entered the school gym that afternoon, the atmosphere was electric. The bleachers were filled with students from all grades, eagerly whispering to each other, waiting for the spectacle to begin. Mr. Thompson stood at the front, grinning as if he were about to watch a gladiator fight. Marcus took a deep breath as he approached the center of the gym. The spotlights were blinding, and the sudden silence as he stepped up made his heart race. Jamal was sitting in the front row, giving him a thumbs up, but the expression on his face was tense. Even he could feel the weight of the moment. "All right, Marcus," Mr. Thompson said, his voice carrying throughout the gym. "You've made quite a name for yourself around here. Let's see if you can really back up the hype. You're going to solve a series of problems, and each one will get progressively harder. You'll have 2 minutes for each one. No pressure." Marcus swallowed hard. The teacher's voice was playful, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, a challenge, a dare that he had no choice but to accept. One of the senior students from the front row called out, "Don't mess up, Marcus. We're watching." The laughter echoed around the gym, and Marcus felt his confidence waver. But he pushed it aside. This wasn't about them. It was about him. Mr. Thompson wrote the first problem on the board, a seemingly simple algebraic equation. Marcus nodded, his mind already working through the problem. But as he stepped forward to solve it, something strange happened. A cold wave of doubt swept over him. What if he couldn't solve it? What if he froze under the pressure? What if this was the moment he would finally fail? He took a deep breath and focused on the numbers. One by one, the pieces fell into place, and within a minute, the solution was clear. He wrote the answer on the board and stepped back, trying to hide the unease in his chest. The crowd remained silent for a brief moment before erupting into scattered applause. "Good start," Mr. Thompson said, his voice laced with a mix of approval and disbelief. "But that was the easy one. Let's see if you can handle this." The next problem was more complicated, advanced calculus, one that would stump most high school seniors. As Marcus read the equation, he realized this was no longer a game. This was a test of everything he had been trying to avoid. The problem wasn't just a math equation, it was a challenge to his entire identity. With his hands shaking slightly, Marcus attacked the problem. The numbers were a blur at first, but as his mind settled, he broke the equation down, each step more confident than the last. 2 minutes felt like an eternity, but as the clock ticked down, he finished, and the answer appeared on the board. The gym erupted into louder applause this time, but Marcus could barely hear it over the pounding of his heart. He didn't feel victorious, he felt exhausted. This wasn't about solving math problems anymore. It was about surviving. And then, as if on cue, Mr. Thompson wrote the final problem on the board. "All right, Marcus," he said, his smile widening. "This is the big one. Let's see if you can really handle the pressure." The room grew eerily quiet. Marcus stared at the equation. He was about to face his greatest challenge yet. The final problem on the board seemed to mock Marcus. It wasn't just an equation, it was a beast. It looked like a tangled mess of numbers, symbols, and formulas, something that could make even the most seasoned mathematician pause. His mind raced, and for the first time since the challenge began, doubt crept into his thoughts. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the marker. The silence in the gym was suffocating. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the entire room was holding its breath. The clock above his head was ticking down relentlessly, mocking him with each passing second. 2 minutes. The numbers on the board swirled in his mind, but he forced himself to focus. It was like every part of his brain was firing at once, piecing together fragments of information from the hundreds of math problems he'd worked on over the years. He could hear the distant hum of the fluorescent lights above him, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. He glanced briefly at the crowd. He could see the faces of his classmates, their eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and expectation. There were students he recognized, some from his advanced classes, others who barely paid attention in school. Everyone was watching him, and the pressure was unbearable. But Marcus had been here before. Not in front of a gym full of people, certainly, but in the quiet of his room, sitting alone at his desk late at night, solving equations that made his mind buzz with excitement. That feeling, that rush, it was familiar. This wasn't about performing in front of an audience. This was about finding the answer, the same way he always had. It was just him and the problem. "Focus, Marcus. You've done this 1,000 times before." With a steady hand, he began to write. The numbers made sense. Slowly at first, but they started to fall into place. Piece by piece, the complex web of algebra, geometry, and calculus unfolded before him. The problem wasn't a puzzle, it was a story, and he could hear it. The equations spoke to him, revealing their secrets with each stroke of his marker. The 2 minutes felt like an eternity, but Marcus was lost in the process. He didn't care about the clock. He didn't care about the people around him. It was just him, his thoughts, and the numbers. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations. His hand moved across the board with precision, writing down variables, simplifying the expression, finding patterns. It was like the equation had become a map, and he was simply following the path it had laid out for him. The room was still dead silent, but it felt like the walls were closing in on him. His palms were slick with sweat, but he ignored it. He was almost there. With only a few seconds left on the clock, Marcus scribbled the final answer. The crowd didn't cheer immediately. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The air in the gym seemed to thicken with tension, and Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't even know if he had done it right. But then, a voice broke the silence. Is that really the answer?" someone whispered from the crowd. It was Jamal, his voice filled with shock. Marcus stepped back from the board, his hand trembling as he wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. He looked at the equation again, his mind racing as he reviewed each step he'd just taken. His heart was in his throat, but then, it hit him. It was right. The answer was correct. He had done it. For a moment, no one moved. And then, like the breaking of a dam, the gym erupted into applause. The students cheered, some standing, others clapping wildly, while a few still seemed in disbelief. Marcus stood there, frozen, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. The noise was deafening, but it didn't feel real. It felt like the world was happening around him, but he was still stuck in that moment of uncertainty. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his face a mix of admiration and something else. Was it surprise? Or was it something deeper? His usual smug smile had faded, replaced by something more genuine. "Well," he said, his voice booming in the gym, "I have to admit, Marcus, you've proved me wrong. I've never seen anything like this before." Marcus barely heard the words. His chest was tight, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had just solved a problem that no one thought could be solved, not in this school, not in front of all these people. It wasn't just about math anymore, it was about the moment when everything changed. He had finally broken free from the expectations that had always been placed on him. The kid from the back row, the quiet one, the one no one took seriously, he had just outsmarted everyone. The applause continued, but it felt distant now. Marcus's mind was spinning, still processing what had just occurred. His classmates surrounded him, slapping him on the back, congratulating him, but it all felt like it was happening in slow motion. And then, in the middle of the chaos, Marcus saw Mr. Thompson walking toward him. The teacher's eyes were still wide with disbelief, but there was something else there too, respect. "You've got a gift, Marcus," Mr. Thompson said, his tone no longer mocking but serious. "I should have known better than to underestimate you." Marcus didn't know how to respond. He just nodded, too stunned to say anything. His heart was still racing, but now, it was a different kind of rush. This was what it felt like to finally prove everyone wrong. To show them that he was more than just the kid they thought he was. But there was still something nagging at him. He had solved the problem, yes. But what did it mean now? Was this just a fluke? Or had he finally found a way to make his brilliance matter? Before he could dwell on it any longer, Jamal was at his side, grinning ear to ear. "See, man. I told you, you got this," Jamal said, throwing an arm around Marcus's shoulder. "You've got some real genius in you, Marcus. People can't ignore that now." Marcus smiled weakly, grateful for Jamal's unwavering belief in him. But there was a part of him that knew this wasn't over. The battle to prove his worth had just begun. As he left the gym, his mind was already spinning with the possibilities. This moment was just the beginning. He had shown them what he was capable of, but now he needed to figure out what to do with it. And more importantly, how to make sure this wasn't the last time anyone underestimated him. The days that followed Marcus's challenge felt like a whirlwind. The shock of his performance still lingered in the air, as if the entire school was holding its collective breath, waiting to see what would come next. Students stopped him in the halls to congratulate him, their words half in awe, half in disbelief. But amidst all the praise, there was an undercurrent of something more complex, something Marcus hadn't fully expected. It was the day after the challenge, and Marcus was sitting in his usual seat at lunch, trying to keep a low profile. Jamal was with him, as usual, but the vibe was different now. There was no laughter, no joking around like they usually did. Today, Jamal was quiet, his expression unreadable. Marcus couldn't help but notice that Jamal wasn't looking at him the same way. "Hey, man," Marcus said, trying to break the silence. "You good?" Jamal glanced up, his eyes a little more serious than usual. "Yeah, I'm good. Just, still kinda processing all this." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Processing? What's there to process?" Jamal shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, I don't know. It's just, things feel different now, Like, after what happened in the gym yesterday, people are starting to look at you differently. And not just in a wow, that was cool way. Some people, I don't know, they're intimidated. Or maybe they just don't know how to handle it." Marcus's chest tightened. He hadn't really thought about it like that. Sure, there had been a wave of admiration, but he hadn't realized that with success came the silent weight of expectations, and worse, fear. It was a strange realization. People didn't just see him as the quiet, overlooked kid anymore. They saw him as someone capable of pulling off the impossible. And that terrified him. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Jamal," Marcus admitted quietly. "I just wanted to prove I wasn't dumb. I didn't want to be invisible anymore." Jamal nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "I get that. But you've gotta understand, man. You're not just proving yourself to people now, you're setting a standard. Everyone's watching you. And that's a lot of pressure." Marcus looked down at his lunch tray, pushing his food around without any real interest. The thought of being constantly watched, scrutinized by everyone, was suffocating. He had never asked for this kind of attention, and now it felt like he couldn't escape it. What if he messed up? What if they all realized he wasn't actually as smart as they thought? The bell rang, and the crowd of students began to disperse, but Marcus wasn't ready to leave. His mind was still whirling with Jamal's words. The pressure was heavy, but even heavier was the fear that he might not be able to live up to the expectations that had suddenly been thrust upon him. As Marcus walked to his next class, he tried to shake off the unease in his chest, but it wouldn't go away. He reached his locker and was about to grab his books when someone tapped him on the shoulder. He turned around to find none other than Mr. Thompson standing behind him, wearing his usual confident smirk. "You've got a lot of people talking, Marcus," Mr. Thompson said, his voice filled with both amusement and something else, pride, maybe? "But let me ask you something, are you going to be able to handle it? Can you keep this up?" Marcus swallowed hard. He didn't know how to answer. I don't know." Mr. Thompson's smirk faded just slightly, replaced by a more serious expression. "You've got something special. That much is clear. But don't let it go to your head. Success can be a dangerous thing. You'll have to work harder now, not just to prove yourself, but to maintain that level of excellence." His words struck a chord deep within Marcus. The pressure was on him, and for the first time, he realized the weight of that responsibility. It wasn't just about doing well once, it was about doing well consistently. Always being the best, always having the answer. The thought of it felt both exhilarating and suffocating at the same time. "I'll try my best," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson nodded, though his eyes seemed to hold something more, a challenge, a warning, or maybe a promise. "Good. You'd better. Because once you start something like this, there's no turning back." As the teacher walked away, Marcus stood there for a long moment, staring at his locker, trying to gather his thoughts. He wasn't sure what he was afraid of more, the fear of failure, or the fear of what would happen if he succeeded and still wasn't happy. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Marcus sat through his classes, but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts kept drifting back to Mr. Thompson's words, to the weight of the expectations that now seemed to hang over him like a cloud. By the time he got home, Marcus was exhausted. He didn't want to talk to anyone, not even Jamal. He just needed some space to think. When he walked through the front door, his mom was there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of her. She smiled at him, but there was a tiredness in her eyes that Marcus couldn't quite place. "How was school today?" she asked, her voice warm but laced with a hint of concern. Marcus hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "It was fine." "Just fine?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "I heard what happened with the math challenge. Everyone's talking about you. You must be pretty proud of yourself." Marcus looked down, his hands clenched tightly by his sides. "I don't know, Mom. Everyone's acting like it's a big deal, but it feels like a lot of pressure. Like, I don't even know if I can keep up with it." His mom studied him for a long moment, her gaze softening. She got up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to be perfect, Marcus," she said gently. "You don't have to live up to anyone's expectations but your own. You're smart, but you're also human. And sometimes, it's okay to fall short. You're still growing. You'll figure it out. Just don't lose sight of who you are." Her words struck Marcus more deeply than he expected. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being true to himself. For the first time in a long while, he felt a small sense of peace wash over him. But even as he nodded in acknowledgement, he knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. The battle for his identity, for his place in the world, had only just begun. And that, in itself, was a kind of challenge he didn't know if he was ready for. The days following Marcus's stunning math challenge performance passed in a blur. Each morning felt like an endless cycle of expectations and pressure, and each evening was filled with doubt and uncertainty. As much as he tried to focus on his schoolwork, his mind kept drifting back to the spotlight he found himself in. In the hallways, whispers followed him. Students who'd barely looked at him before now stopped to say something, whether it was a quick congratulations or a casual remark. But no one really understood what it was like to walk in his shoes now, to carry the weight of being the genius. Sure, it was nice to be acknowledged, but it wasn't the praise that kept Marcus awake at night. It was the fear of not being able to keep up, of letting down the people who now saw him as something more than just the quiet kid from the back row. That day, during homeroom, Marcus sat at his desk, trying to focus on the lesson as Mr. Thompson droned on in front of the class. The words barely made sense to him. His brain was somewhere else, still replaying the events of the challenge. The equation, the clock ticking down, the look on Mr. Thompson's face when Marcus had solved the problem. But today was different. There was a new energy in the room. Marcus could feel it in the air, something was about to happen. He didn't know what it was, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, as if his instincts were warning him of a coming storm. "Class," Mr. Thompson's voice broke through Marcus's thoughts, "I hope you all understand how important the next few weeks are. We'll be diving into more complex material, and it's crucial you stay ahead of the curve." Marcus glanced up. His heart skipped a beat as he saw Mr. Thompson's eyes on him. "Marcus," Mr. Thompson continued, his gaze never leaving Marcus's, "since you've shown such extraordinary ability in mathematics, I've arranged for you to attend a special study group after school. The group is made up of top students, and I think it'll be a great opportunity for you to push yourself even further." The words stung more than they should have. Special study group. The top students. He could already hear the murmurs in the class, the eyes of his classmates turning toward him. It was like a spotlight had been turned on, and he didn't know if he could stand the heat anymore. Jamal leaned over from the desk next to him, his voice low but full of concern. "You okay, man? You don't look so hot." Marcus gave a strained smile, trying to hide the anxiety creeping up on him. "Yeah, just, don't know what to expect, that's all." "You're gonna crush it," Jamal reassured him with a grin. "I know you. But hey, take it easy, all right? Marcus nodded absently, though his mind was already racing. A special study group, what did that mean for him? Was he ready for this? Could he keep up with these top students, whoever they were? What if he wasn't as smart as they thought he was? After school, Marcus made his way to the room where the study group was supposed to meet. As he entered, the room was quiet, filled with students who looked far too confident for his liking. The small group was already gathered, flipping through textbooks and taking notes. They didn't look at Marcus when he walked in, didn't acknowledge his presence, except for one person. At the back of the room, sitting with a stack of papers spread out before her, was Emily. She was a senior, one of the best students in the school. Her reputation preceded her, sharp, determined, and relentless in everything she did. Marcus had always admired her from a distance. She was the epitome of the student everyone else aspired to be. Her eyes flicked up when he entered, and for a brief moment, she made eye contact with him. There was no smile, no welcome, just an assessing look, as if she was trying to size him up. "You're Marcus, right?" Emily's voice was cool, but there was an undercurrent of something more, something that made Marcus uneasy. "Yeah," he replied, his voice tight. She nodded, and then returned to her papers. It wasn't a dismissive gesture, but it didn't offer much reassurance either. Marcus slowly took a seat at the edge of the room, away from the main group, and tried to calm his racing thoughts. As the study session began, Mr. Thompson outlined the first problem, a multi-layered calculus equation. It was advanced, even for the top students. As the rest of the group dove into their calculations, Marcus hesitated, looking at the problem on the board. It was massive, numbers and variables swimming before his eyes like an alien language. He tried to focus, but his mind kept returning to that familiar anxiety, the feeling of being out of place. He had no right to be here. These students were clearly out of his league. He glanced over at Emily. She was scribbling away at her notebook, her pen moving like a machine, her face serious. Every time Marcus looked at her, he felt smaller, less capable. She was everything he was trying to be. Calm. Collected. Confident. The minutes passed, but Marcus hadn't written down a single thing. He kept staring at the problem, his thoughts swirling like a tornado. He was supposed to be one of the best. He had proven himself with that math challenge, but here, in this room, with all these eyes on him, he was doubting every inch of his ability. Finally, Emily's voice broke the silence, pulling Marcus out of his spiral. "Marcus," she said, her tone steady but sharp, "you're looking at this problem like it's an obstacle. It's just math. You have to break it down, piece by piece. Don't try to do it all at once." Her words hit him harder than he expected. She wasn't offering praise or encouragement, she was simply stating a fact, something so obvious, yet so difficult for him to grasp in this moment of doubt. Piece by piece. Marcus took a deep breath and shifted his focus. Slowly, methodically, he started to break the equation down. He couldn't solve it all at once, but he could tackle it step by step. For the first time that day, the panic in his chest began to ease. The numbers started to make sense, and the solution seemed possible. Piece by piece, the problem unraveled. Minutes later, Marcus put down his pen, feeling a sense of accomplishment. He wasn't done, but he had made progress, real progress. It was the first step toward breaking free from his doubts. When he looked up, Emily was watching him, her gaze no longer assessing but thoughtful. "You're not as bad as I thought," she said, almost like a compliment. Marcus nodded, surprised by the unexpected sense of relief that washed over him. Maybe he wasn't as out of place as he'd thought. Maybe he did belong here, even if just a little bit. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of Marcus truly understanding what it meant to be great, not because of the praise or the attention, but because he had the strength to keep moving forward, even when everything inside him screamed to stop. The following week felt like an uphill battle. Marcus found himself balancing the intense expectations of the study group, the whispers in the halls, and his own rising doubts. Every day, he woke up with the weight of the world on his shoulders, but each day was also a small victory. He was learning to push through the pressure, to silence the voice in his head that told him he wasn't enough. But even when he felt like he was inching forward, a new challenge always seemed to emerge, demanding more than he could give. It was Friday afternoon when the next big test came. Marcus was heading out of his last class when he saw Jamal standing by the lockers, a familiar smirk on his face. But today, there was something different in Jamal's eyes, a gleam of excitement that made Marcus pause. "Yo, Marcus." Jamal waved him down as Marcus approached. "I got something for you, man." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Jamal handed him a flyer. It was bright, colorful, and covered in bold letters. "The annual math tournament," Marcus read aloud, feeling his stomach drop. "Are you kidding me? This is like national level stuff." Jamal laughed. "Exactly. I signed you up. You're gonna crush this, man." Marcus's head spun. A national math tournament? That was way beyond anything he'd ever considered. Sure, the study group had been tough, but it was nothing compared to this. The flyer seemed to mock him with its list of previous winners, students who were practically geniuses, people he didn't even think were human. He had no idea why Jamal thought he could compete at that level. "Jamal, are you serious?" Marcus's voice faltered as he tried to process the news. "I don't even know if I'm ready for something like this." "There's no way." "Listen," Jamal cut him off, his voice filled with confidence. "I know what you're thinking, but you're ready. You've already done the impossible once. Now it's time to do it again. And don't worry, I've got your back every step of the way." Marcus stared at the flyer, the weight of it sinking in. A part of him wanted to run away from it, to say no and keep his life simple. But another part, the part that had surprised even him when he solved that equation in front of the whole school, wanted to take the challenge head on. "All right," Marcus finally said, taking a deep breath. "I'll do it. But I don't know what I'm getting myself into." "That's the spirit." Jamal slapped him on the back. "Trust me, you've got this. I've seen it." Marcus tried to hide the anxiety bubbling up in his chest, but it was useless. He was scared, but at the same time, something about the idea of the challenge made him feel alive. This could be his moment, his chance to prove that he wasn't just a fluke, that he was capable of more than anyone ever expected. The days leading up to the tournament were a blur of practice, self-doubt, and determination. Marcus studied late into the night, tackling problems that seemed impossible at first. He would stare at the equations for hours, frustration mounting with every missed answer. But every time he felt like quitting, he thought back to Emily's words during the study group, piece by piece. Slowly, he began to break down the problems, one step at a time, and with each solution, his confidence grew. Jamal continued to encourage him, always there with a joke or a reminder to stay focused. "Don't forget," Jamal would say, "you're doing this for you. Not for anyone else. You've got the brains. Now just use them." Despite the growing confidence in his ability, the fear still lingered. This wasn't just some school competition. This was a national math tournament, where the stakes were much higher. Marcus was about to face off against some of the best students in the country, and he was terrified of failing in front of everyone. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't just about math anymore. It was about proving to himself that he was more than the kid who had once been overlooked. He wasn't just smart, he was capable. And if he could take on the best in the country and walk away with his head held high, then maybe, just maybe, he'd finally start to believe in himself. The day of the tournament arrived, and the energy in the air was electric. The moment Marcus stepped into the conference hall, he felt it, the sharp tension, the hum of anticipation. Everywhere he looked, there were students who looked like they belonged here, who had been preparing for this day their entire lives. The air smelled of competition, of eager minds ready to battle it out. Jamal was with him, of course, offering last-minute pep talks and cracking jokes to keep Marcus relaxed. "You're gonna kill it, man," he said, clapping Marcus on the back as they stood in line for registration. Marcus's heart was racing. He could feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him. And it was hard to ignore the voices in his head, the ones telling him he wasn't good enough, that he was out of his league. But this time, he wasn't going to listen. This was his moment to shine, and he couldn't back down now. As they filed into the competition room, Marcus felt a surge of determination. He was here for one reason, to prove to himself that he belonged. This wasn't just about being the smartest kid in the class anymore. This was about proving that he could overcome his doubts, his fears, and rise to the occasion. He took his seat, surrounded by students who looked far too confident for his liking. But Marcus held his head high, his mind sharpening with focus. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready. When the timer started, Marcus dove into the first question without hesitation. The problem was complex, layered with variables he had never seen before, but he didn't flinch. He took a deep breath, and like Emily had said, he broke it down, piece by piece. As the minutes ticked away, Marcus lost himself in the puzzle. The rest of the world faded away. The doubt, the fear, even the pressure, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was the math, and his mind was clear, sharp, and unstoppable. The tournament was well underway, and Marcus was in the zone. He could feel the pulse of the room as the competition intensified. Students around him scribbled furiously on their papers, some tapping their pens nervously, others exuding the confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment their entire life. Marcus, however, was different. He was still new to this world of relentless competition, of high expectations, but as the problems stacked up in front of him, he started to feel the excitement rather than the fear. For the first time since he'd stepped into the competition, Marcus felt like he truly belonged. The problems weren't easy. In fact, they were grueling, demanding every ounce of focus and intellect he had. But Marcus had a secret weapon. He wasn't just solving equations, he was methodically dismantling each problem with the precision of a master. His mind worked like a machine, each part clicking into place. What had seemed like impossible challenges in the classroom just weeks before now felt like puzzles begging to be solved. And then, just as Marcus was feeling the high of conquering problem after problem, he noticed something strange. In the corner of the room, seated at a desk that seemed oddly isolated from the others, there was a student Marcus had never seen before. He was a tall, lean figure with disheveled hair, wearing a hoodie that was just a little too big for him. His expression was unreadable, focused entirely on his work, and despite the fact that he was surrounded by some of the best students in the country, there was something about his quiet demeanor that made Marcus uneasy. It wasn't just the fact that this student was clearly out of place, it was the way he was solving the problems. Marcus watched, without meaning to, as the student completed problems with a speed and accuracy that was nothing short of terrifying. His pen moved rapidly across the paper, his focus unbroken, and every time Marcus glanced at him, the student had already solved the problem he was struggling with. That was when Marcus felt a wave of doubt crash over him. Was he really doing his best? Was he truly as capable as he thought? Or was he just fooling himself, pretending to be something he wasn't? The questions gnawed at him, but he quickly shook them off. He wasn't here to worry about other people. He was here to prove to himself that he had what it took. Still, the stranger's presence didn't go unnoticed. In the midst of the competition, whispers began to ripple through the room. "Who is that guy?" someone murmured. "I've never seen him before. Does anyone know his name? I've heard rumors he's a prodigy or something. Some sort of math genius." The murmurs continued, but Marcus didn't pay them much mind. He had to keep his focus. He had to do his best. He couldn't let anyone else distract him, not even this unknown, silent competitor. But the tension in the air was undeniable. As the rounds went on, the mystery student, who now became known as Alex, continued to dominate. With every correct answer, the whispers grew louder. "He's faster than anyone here," someone said, barely able to hide their awe. Marcus felt the pressure mounting, but it wasn't the pressure from the competition that scared him, it was the pressure from within. He couldn't let Alex outshine him. He wouldn't. The next round was the hardest yet, an intricate problem that combined geometry, algebra, and trigonometry. Marcus felt his heart race as the question flashed on the screen in front of him. He wasn't sure where to start. His mind felt like it was going blank. And then he glanced up at Alex again. The student was already moving to his next problem. It was as though he had solved the current one in the blink of an eye. Marcus could barely keep up with his thoughts, but Alex had already moved on. Marcus shook his head, trying to refocus. He couldn't think about Alex. He couldn't. But it was hard. The sight of this unassuming kid tearing through problems like they were nothing was beginning to shake Marcus's confidence. What if this was it? What if this was the moment that exposed his weakness? He was out of his depth, and no matter how much he wanted to push forward, the doubt crept in like a shadow over his mind. "Focus, Marcus," he whispered to himself, squeezing his pencil until his hand ached. "Piece by piece. Just solve it, one step at a time." That's when it hit him. The key to the problem wasn't in trying to solve it all at once, it was in breaking it down. Just like he had done before. Slowly, methodically, Marcus started to piece the equation together. And as the answer became clearer, the weight on his shoulders began to lift. Suddenly, Marcus found himself finishing the problem ahead of the timer, his hands shaking slightly with the rush of adrenaline. He looked up and saw Alex still working, his pen moving with eerie precision, but Marcus didn't feel that same crippling anxiety anymore. He had done it. He had solved the problem. And he was going to do it again. As the competition drew to a close, the tension was thick in the air. Marcus felt his heart pounding in his chest as the last round of problems was announced. This was it, the final stretch, the ultimate test of everything he'd learned. He wasn't sure if he could take the pressure, but there was no turning back now. The room was eerily silent as the students scribbled their final answers. Marcus could hear the frantic scratching of pens, the occasional sigh of frustration. His mind was laser-focused as he tackled the final problem. His hands moved quickly across the paper, almost instinctively, as his mind solved the puzzle. But then, as the timer counted down, Marcus's eyes flicked up once again to Alex. The stranger was still working, his face a mask of concentration, but there was something different about the way he moved. His focus seemed unshakable, as if this was the easiest thing he'd ever done. Marcus finished the problem just as the timer buzzed, signaling the end of the round. He sat back, breathless, and glanced around the room. The competition was fierce, and Alex, without a doubt, was the most formidable opponent he'd faced. But Marcus had done his best. And that was all he could do. The scores would be announced soon, but Marcus didn't feel the usual pressure or anxiety anymore. He had pushed through his self-doubt. He had faced the challenge head-on. But the question lingered, would it be enough? The air in the competition hall was thick with anticipation as the judges took their time to tally the scores. Marcus sat in his seat, trying to remain calm, but his stomach twisted in knots. He had given everything he had to this competition. His mind was exhausted, his body tired, but it was a different kind of fatigue. This wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was emotional. He had pushed himself harder than ever before, testing his limits and then pushing beyond them. And yet, despite everything he had done, the doubt lingered. What if it wasn't enough? What if Alex, the mysterious, calm genius who had breezed through the competition like it was a walk in the park, had done better than him? Every so often, his eyes would dart across the room, catching glimpses of Alex. The other students sat in tense silence, but Alex seemed unaffected, as though he didn't even care about the outcome. His arms were crossed, his expression neutral, but there was an air of certainty around him. A calm that made Marcus nervous. "Hey, man," Jamal whispered from the seat beside him, trying to offer some comfort. "You did great. No matter what happens, you pushed yourself harder than anyone else here. That's more than most people will ever do." Marcus nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to face a harsh reality. Jamal had been encouraging throughout the whole experience, but it didn't help that Marcus felt like a fish out of water. This wasn't his world, and no matter how much he tried to pretend otherwise, he still felt like he didn't belong. Finally, the judges took the stage. The room fell silent as the competition coordinator, a tall man with glasses and a stern expression, stepped up to the podium. His voice boomed across the room, commanding the attention of everyone present. "Thank you all for your participation today. We've tallied the scores, and the results are in. First of all, I want to commend everyone for their hard work and dedication. This is no easy challenge, and each one of you has proven that you belong here." Marcus couldn't help but notice the way some of the more confident students leaned forward, eager to hear the results. Their faces betrayed little emotion, but there was a sense of competitiveness in the air. A few students glanced around nervously, wondering if they'd made the cut. Marcus could feel his heart pounding, each beat louder than the last. "We'll start with the top 3. In third place, with an impressive score, is Daniel Haskins." There was a round of applause as a student from the back of the room walked up to accept his award. Daniel's face showed a mix of relief and pride, but Marcus didn't feel a flicker of recognition. He barely knew the guy. Second place goes to Alex Carter. Marcus froze, his heart sinking in his chest. Alex? He hadn't expected it, of course not. After watching him solve problems with such ease, it seemed like a given that Alex would take first place. Which means, the coordinator continued, the first place winner, with a near-perfect score, is Marcus Williams. The room erupted in shock. Marcus blinked, his mind trying to process what had just happened. Was this real? Had he really just won the national math tournament? He could hear the applause around him, the gasps of disbelief, but it all sounded muffled, as if he were hearing it from far away. The coordinator smiled at him, motioning for him to step forward. "Come on up, Marcus. You've earned it." Marcus stood, his legs shaky beneath him. The applause seemed to grow louder as he walked toward the stage, his feet feeling like they were made of lead. His mind raced. This was impossible. He had beaten Alex. He had beaten everyone. But how? As he reached the podium, the coordinator handed him a trophy, a shining, polished symbol of everything he'd just achieved. But Marcus barely noticed it. His eyes were locked on Alex, who was standing off to the side, looking as stoic and unreadable as ever. The whispers around the room grew louder. Marcus Williams? The kid who? No way. He beat Alex. I thought Alex was unbeatable. Marcus's pulse raced. How had he done it? How had he outpaced Alex, the student who had seemed to know the answers before the questions were even fully presented? It didn't make sense. Not even in his wildest dreams had he thought he'd win, let alone beat someone like Alex. The tension from earlier, the pressure to perform, had been overwhelming. But somehow, in that final moment, it all clicked. He had trusted himself. He had believed in his ability, even when everything inside him screamed that he was out of his league. Alex, however, didn't seem surprised. He gave Marcus a brief nod from across the room, his expression unchanged. It was like Alex had known all along that Marcus would take the win. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this, something about Alex that he couldn't quite figure out. Back in the lobby, after the ceremony had concluded, Marcus found Jamal waiting for him, a wide grin plastered on his face. "I told you, man," Jamal said, clapping Marcus on the back. "You were amazing out there. Nobody saw that coming, huh? Marcus tried to smile, but the reality of what had just happened was still sinking in. I can't believe I won. I mean, I thought Alex was going to take it for sure. He was incredible. Jamal raised an eyebrow. Yeah, he's good. But you were better. And that's what counts. You showed everyone what you're capable of. Marcus looked around, the enormity of the moment finally beginning to hit him. He had done it. He had proven to himself, and to everyone else, that he was more than just the kid who had been underestimated. He had stepped into the unknown, taken the challenge, and come out victorious. But something still tugged at him. There was a question that refused to leave his mind, something about Alex, something about the way the competition had unfolded. Before Marcus could voice his thoughts, Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Hey, you better check this out, Jamal said, showing Marcus the screen. It was a post from the math tournament's social media page. It was a picture of Alex with the caption, Alex Carter, rumored to be an anonymous math prodigy, has left his mark on the competition today, securing second place in an impressive display of raw talent. Marcus's stomach churned. So, Alex was a prodigy. But why had he played it so cool? Why had he made it look effortless when the stakes were so high? The answer wasn't clear yet, but one thing was for sure, this was just the beginning. The tournament had opened Marcus's eyes to a new world of possibilities, and whatever the future held, he knew one thing, he wasn't going to stop now. Not when there was so much more to learn, and so many more mountains to climb. The victory celebration was in full swing, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The adrenaline from winning first place had barely settled, but a strange sense of unease lingered in his chest. Everyone around him seemed to be buzzing with excitement, but Marcus' thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Alex Carter, the quiet, enigmatic student who had come in second place. He had expected Alex to win, but not in the way that had unfolded. Marcus had watched him carefully during the competition, trying to understand what made him so good. Alex didn't break a sweat. It was almost as if he was operating on a different level, one that Marcus couldn't quite reach, no matter how hard he tried. Now, sitting in the corner of the crowded hall with Jamal and a few other students, Marcus couldn't focus on the conversations around him. His mind kept drifting back to Alex. Who was he really? What was his story? Hey, man, you okay? Jamal's voice broke through his thoughts, snapping Marcus back to the present. Marcus looked up, blinking as if he had been lost in a dream. Huh? Oh, yeah, just thinking about the competition. You mean how you just crushed it? Jamal chuckled, nudging Marcus with his elbow. Seriously, dude, no one saw that coming. You took home first place, and you're still over here acting like it's no big deal. Marcus smiled faintly. I know. I can't stop thinking about Alex. Something doesn't add up. Jamal raised an eyebrow. Alex? Dude, you're overthinking this. He's a math genius, right? He came in second. It's not like you lost to him. You beat everyone. I know, but it's not just that, Marcus said, lowering his voice as if to keep their conversation private. The way he handled the competition, it was like he was playing a different game. Like he already knew he wasn't going to win, but still performed at a ridiculously high level. And did you notice how calm he was the whole time? It was like nothing fazed him. Jamal shook his head. Man, you're way too focused on Alex. He's good, no doubt. But you won fair and square. Stop worrying about it. Marcus hesitated. He knew Jamal was trying to reassure him, but the doubt gnawed at him. Why had Alex been so calm? Why hadn't he seemed surprised when Marcus took first place? Marcus had seen the subtle flicker of acknowledgement in Alex's eyes when the final results were announced. It was as if Alex knew exactly what was coming, like he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. There was more to Alex than met the eye. Marcus could feel it. "Maybe you're right," Marcus said finally, though the uncertainty still hung in the air. "But I just can't let it go. I need to know more about him." As if on cue, Marcus' phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from an unfamiliar number. "Hey, Marcus. It's Alex. We need to talk. Meet me after the celebration ends." Marcus' heart skipped a beat. What was this about? Why would Alex want to meet him? And why now? "What is it?" Jamal asked, peering over Marcus' shoulder. "It's Alex," Marcus muttered, feeling a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "He wants to talk." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "What, like right now?" "Dude, he's probably just congratulating you. But if you're gonna meet up with him, just make sure you don't get caught up in some weird rivalry. You've got to focus on your win, man." Marcus wasn't so sure. There was something in Alex's message that felt different. This wasn't just about congratulating him. It was something more. And Marcus couldn't ignore the feeling that he was about to uncover something that might change everything. "I'll meet him," Marcus said, already standing up. "I need to figure out what's going on with him. I'll let you know how it goes." Jamal gave him a cautious look. "All right, man. Just be careful. Whatever you do, don't let him throw you off your game. You've already proven yourself." Marcus nodded, though the uncertainty still gnawed at him. He didn't know what Alex wanted, but something told him this conversation would be important. It might even be the key to unlocking everything that was still unclear. The celebration hall was beginning to empty out when Marcus finally slipped away. He followed the message's instructions, making his way toward the back of the building, where the quiet hallways seemed to isolate him from the rest of the crowd. As he turned the corner, he spotted Alex standing alone, leaning against the wall. His face was as neutral as ever, but Marcus noticed the tension in his posture, the way he was watching Marcus approach. "So," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's this about?" Alex looked up, his eyes locking onto Marcus. There was a faint smile on his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I wanted to talk to you. Congratulations, by the way. You did better than I expected." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Better than you expected? You don't seem too surprised." "Honestly, I thought you'd win." Alex pushed off from the wall, his arms folding across his chest. "Yeah, I get that a lot. But winning isn't always about being the fastest or the most impressive. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to push and when to step back." Marcus frowned, confused. "What do you mean by that?" Alex took a step closer. "I could have taken first place easily. You know that, right? I've been competing at this level for years. But I didn't. I intentionally let you win." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "You what?" Alex's expression softened slightly. "I've been watching you, Marcus. You've got something that the rest of these kids don't have. It's not just raw talent. It's your drive. You pushed yourself harder than anyone else here. And that's why you won. But it's more than just winning. It's about proving to yourself that you're capable of more than you think." Marcus was stunned. He had been so focused on beating Alex, on proving his own worth, that he hadn't even considered the possibility that Alex had let him win. But now, looking into Alex's eyes, Marcus could see something different, a kind of respect. "So, you weren't trying to win?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alex shook his head. "Not today. Today was about you. I wanted to see if you had the drive to push through. And you did. That's why I'm here. I want to help you take your abilities to the next level." The words hung in the air, and Marcus felt his heart race. What was Alex offering him? Was this the beginning of something more, something bigger than just a math competition? Alex took a step back. Think about it, Marcus. You've got potential. But potential means nothing if you don't know how to harness it. If you're willing to learn, I can show you how to reach your true potential. But you have to be ready. Marcus' mind was spinning. This was the moment. The moment that could change everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The air in the quiet hallway felt thick with possibility. Marcus stood there, staring at Alex as his words echoed in his mind. You've got potential. But potential means nothing if you don't know how to harness it. It was an offer Marcus had never expected to hear. The idea of Alex, the math prodigy who had breezed through the competition, offering to mentor him felt surreal. Just moments ago, Marcus had been unsure of himself, questioning how he'd even managed to win. But now, everything had changed. Alex's presence felt almost magnetic, pulling Marcus into a decision that seemed too big to make in the span of a few seconds. Could he really trust this guy? Could he really accept the idea of someone like Alex, with so many talents of his own, wanting to help him? Are you serious? Marcus finally asked, trying to break the silence, though his voice betrayed the doubt still swirling in his chest. Alex nodded, his expression serious. I wouldn't offer if I didn't think you had what it takes. But this isn't going to be easy. It's not about just math. It's about pushing yourself, challenging everything you thought you knew. And that's why I'm here. You've got more inside you than you realize, Marcus. The mention of pushing yourself sparked something in Marcus. He had always been the kid who worked hard, but he had never really known what it meant to truly challenge himself. To reach for something beyond the familiar. I've seen what you can do, Alex continued. You're not like the others. You didn't just show up and rely on your natural talent. You worked for it. You fought through the mental blocks, the doubts. And that's why I'm offering this to you. But it's up to you, Marcus. If you want to stay where you are, that's fine. But if you want to move forward, I'll help you get there. Marcus stood frozen. The weight of the decision settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Could he really do this? Could he step into the unknown and trust Alex, a person he didn't fully understand? It was a chance to grow, to become more than just the kid who barely made it to the top, to become someone who could truly belong in the world Alex seemed to effortlessly navigate. And then there was his own self-doubt, something that had lingered in his mind since the first day he'd stepped into this competition. He hadn't expected to win. In fact, the idea of being a champion hadn't even seemed possible. But here he was, holding a trophy in his hands, a symbol of his success. And still, he didn't feel fully capable. I don't know, Alex, Marcus admitted, his voice quieter now. I'm not sure if I'm ready for that kind of pressure. What if I let you down? What if I can't live up to what you're expecting? Alex's expression softened, and for the first time, Marcus saw a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. No one is asking you to be perfect. But the question is, are you willing to try? To push yourself further than you ever have before? Marcus stared at him, feeling the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just about math. It was about growth. About moving past his limitations. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of things he had never imagined. He had always worked hard, but now there was a chance to work smarter, to learn from someone who had already reached the heights he only dreamed of. Could he do it? I'll do it, Marcus said, his voice steady now, though his heart was still racing. I want to learn. I want to push myself. Alex nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. Good. Because the real work starts now. The next few days passed in a blur. Marcus couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Alex. He had agreed to take the plunge, but now the enormity of the commitment was beginning to sink in. What had he gotten himself into? Alex wasn't the type to offer something like this without expecting results. He had seen it firsthand during the competition. Alex wasn't someone who played games. But despite the anxiety gnawing at him, Marcus felt a spark of excitement, too. This was the chance he had been waiting for, the opportunity to become the person he knew he could be. He couldn't afford to let fear hold him back now. The following week, Alex sent Marcus a series of cryptic messages, puzzles and problems that seemed almost impossible at first glance. But Alex wasn't interested in just solving equations. The problems were designed to stretch Marcus' mind, to push him to think in ways he had never considered before. The first problem Alex sent was a series of complex algebraic expressions. At first, Marcus stared at the equations, frustrated by how tangled they seemed. But instead of giving up, he broke the problem down piece by piece. As he worked through each step, a sense of clarity started to take over. The tension in his mind began to ease, and soon, he had solved the problem, faster than he thought possible. Then came a logic puzzle, an intricate sequence of statements and contradictions that seemed impossible to untangle. But Alex's voice echoed in his mind, think differently. Challenge what you know. Think outside the box. Marcus spent hours on that puzzle, but the sense of triumph when he finally cracked it was exhilarating. It wasn't just about solving the problem. It was about testing the limits of his own thinking. Each challenge Alex set for him was more difficult than the last, but with each one, Marcus felt himself changing. His approach to problem solving was becoming more intuitive, more fluid. He was no longer just solving equations for the sake of solving them. He was learning to see patterns, to anticipate obstacles, to adapt. But there was something deeper happening, too. With every lesson Alex taught him, Marcus began to realize that the greatest challenge wasn't the equations or the puzzles. The hardest part was believing in himself. Every time he solved a problem, he grew a little more confident. He began to see what Alex had seen in him, the potential that had always been there, hidden beneath layers of doubt and fear. Weeks passed, and the intensity of the training only increased. Marcus was no longer the unsure student he had once been. He had become sharper, more focused, and his skills had grown in ways he never imagined. But just as he was starting to feel invincible, the weight of the decision he had made began to settle in. One afternoon, as Marcus was working through a particularly tough problem, he received a message from Alex. "We're meeting up tomorrow. I need to see how far you've come. Prepare yourself. This next challenge is going to test everything you've learned." Marcus stared at the message for a long time. He had grown so much, but he knew that whatever Alex had in store would push him further than ever before. He was ready, but part of him was terrified. This wasn't just about math anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could handle the pressure. That he could become the person Alex believed he could be. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Tomorrow would change everything. Marcus stood in front of his mirror the next morning, adjusting his shirt as he stared at his reflection. The usual nervousness before a big day was present, but there was something different this time. He was no longer that unsure, self-doubting kid who had first entered the competition. He was someone else now, someone who had grown, learned, and started to believe in his own potential. Today wasn't just about solving problems. It wasn't just about completing challenges. Today was about everything he had learned up until now, all of the mental and emotional hurdles he had overcome, and whether or not he could stand tall when it truly mattered. The message from Alex the previous night had been simple, but the implications were clear. Prepare yourself. This next challenge is going to test everything you've learned. Marcus was more than ready. At least, he thought he was. By the time Marcus arrived at the small, unassuming building that Alex had directed him to, his stomach was a mix of excitement and anxiety. The building was located on the edge of town, far from the buzzing energy of the high school campus. It almost felt like an intentional isolation, as though Alex wanted to pull Marcus out of his comfort zone. The door to the building was unlocked, and Marcus stepped inside. It was quiet, almost eerily so. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with math textbooks, philosophical works, and scientific journals. In the center of the room was a large whiteboard, and seated at the desk, as always, was Alex. "Come in, Marcus," Alex said, his voice calm but with an underlying sharpness. "We've got a lot to cover today." Marcus walked into the room, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness. This was it, the ultimate test. He had no idea what Alex had prepared, but he was sure of one thing: it was going to be unlike anything he'd encountered before. "How are you feeling?" Alex asked, glancing up from his desk. He was calm, as always, his expression unreadable. Marcus took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. "Ready," he said, his voice steady. "Let's do this." Alex gave a brief nod and stood up, walking toward the whiteboard. "Good. This challenge will be different from anything you've done before. I'm not going to give you a single equation, Marcus. No puzzles, no formulas. This is about the way you think. The way you solve problems. It's about testing your mindset under pressure." Marcus frowned, a little confused. "What do you mean?" Alex didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a sealed envelope. He walked over to Marcus and handed it to him without a word. The envelope was heavy, the paper stiff, and it felt like it contained something significant. "Open it," Alex said. Marcus took the envelope and carefully tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten with a series of cryptic instructions. "Your goal is simple: find a solution to the problem of infinite space. You will be presented with a series of situations, each more complicated than the last. Solve them, or fail. There is no in-between. Once you begin, you cannot stop. Begin." Marcus blinked at the words on the page, trying to make sense of them. Infinite space. What does that even mean? Alex was watching him closely. "You'll figure it out as you go. But remember, this isn't just about intellect. It's about how you handle uncertainty, how you deal with a challenge when you have no clear answers. There is no right answer here, Marcus. Only your ability to think through the chaos." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't about formulas, or patterns, or anything familiar. This was different. This was more abstract, more philosophical than anything he had encountered. But that was exactly why Alex was offering him this test, wasn't it? To push him beyond his limits. "Start when you're ready," Alex said, returning to his desk. "There's no time limit, but don't waste time. Every second you delay is a second lost." Marcus stared at the paper in his hands. Infinite space. Chaos. Uncertainty. Was this even a problem that could be solved? Or was it just a mental exercise in resilience? His mind raced with possibilities, but nothing concrete came to mind. "Think, Marcus," Alex's voice cut through his thoughts. "What do you know about space? What do you know about infinity?" Marcus took a deep breath and tried to push his initial panic aside. This was what Alex had been preparing him for. The lessons weren't just about solving equations, they were about teaching him how to think through problems when there were no clear answers. He began pacing, thinking about everything he had learned in the past few weeks. Space. Infinity. What did those concepts really mean? In mathematics, infinity was a concept, something that could be approached but never fully realized. In physics, space was a seemingly infinite expanse, full of unknowns. But how did they relate to each other? What was the true meaning of infinite space? The more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just a theoretical problem, it was a metaphor. A challenge to his mindset, to his approach to uncertainty. Could he find meaning in the chaos? Could he accept that not all problems had an immediate solution? He turned to the whiteboard and grabbed a marker. The first thing he wrote was the word infinity in large, bold letters. He underlined it several times, thinking about how infinity had no boundaries. No beginning. No end. A concept that couldn't be fully grasped. As he stood there, Marcus felt the weight of the challenge sink in. He wasn't just solving a problem. He was finding a way to embrace the unknown, to move forward even when there was no clear path. Hours passed, and Marcus lost track of time. As he worked, the ideas began to flow more freely. He scribbled equations, diagrams, and theories on the whiteboard, his mind constantly shifting from one idea to the next. He wasn't solving the problem in the traditional sense, but he was thinking through the chaos, analyzing, adapting, accepting that sometimes, answers didn't come immediately. Every now and then, he would glance over at Alex, who was observing him silently from his desk. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet expectation. Marcus realized that this was the true test, not just his ability to solve a problem, but his ability to think outside the box, to embrace uncertainty, and to push through when there were no obvious answers. At last, after what seemed like an eternity, Marcus took a step back from the whiteboard. He had no perfect solution, no neat answer to the problem of infinite space. But that was the point. The solution wasn't about a fixed answer, it was about the journey, the process of thinking through the problem itself. Alex stood up and walked over to Marcus, taking in the mess of notes and equations on the board. He nodded slowly, clearly impressed. "You've done well, Marcus. You didn't give up. You didn't expect immediate answers. You worked through the uncertainty, and you understood that sometimes, the answer isn't about a solution, it's about the way you approach the challenge." Marcus exhaled, the weight of the challenge finally lifting from his shoulders. "It was more than I expected." Alex smiled faintly. "That's the point. You didn't just solve a problem, Marcus. You learned how to think. How to handle uncertainty. How to push yourself when the answers aren't clear. This is the real work. And you've passed the test." The room was silent for a moment. Marcus stood there, processing what had just happened. He hadn't solved the problem in the way he thought he would. But in the end, that didn't matter. What mattered was how he had approached the challenge. And for the first time, Marcus realized that the greatest test wasn't in the solutions he found, it was in how he grew through the process. The following days felt different. Marcus had passed the ultimate test. Or, more accurately, he had learned to embrace it. No longer was he the student consumed by doubt and confusion. He had crossed an invisible threshold that, though subtle, had completely shifted the way he viewed himself and his abilities. But even as he basked in the quiet victory of his own growth, there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. There was something more Alex wasn't telling him. Something still looming on the horizon, waiting for Marcus to face it head-on. As the weeks passed, Marcus found himself more focused than ever. He began taking more risks in his studies, diving into complex subjects that once would have intimidated him. He wasn't just completing assignments anymore, he was seeking challenges, approaching them with the same clarity of mind that had helped him solve Alex's ultimate test. It wasn't just math he was excelling at now. The way he approached problems in life, whether it was dealing with personal issues or navigating relationships, had shifted as well. The lessons Alex had subtly taught him about resilience, adaptability, and perspective were seeping into every corner of his life. But through it all, there was that sense of something unfinished, something waiting to be unlocked. One afternoon, as Marcus sat at his desk working through an advanced problem in physics, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Alex. "Meet me at the cafe. We need to talk." Marcus felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. Alex rarely asked him to meet in person unless it was important. But he didn't overthink it. He grabbed his things and headed out the door, his mind running over the possibilities. The cafe was a small, cozy place on the corner of a quiet street, one of those spots that Marcus had always passed by but never entered. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and pastries hung in the air, a contrast to the tense feeling he was trying to shake off. Alex was sitting by the window, a cup of coffee in front of him. As soon as Marcus entered, Alex gestured for him to sit. "Thanks for coming," Alex said, his tone unusually serious. Marcus took a seat across from him, his heart starting to race. "What's going on, Alex? You've got me curious." Alex didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You've been progressing at a remarkable rate, Marcus. I think it's time we talked about the next step." Marcus raised an eyebrow, confused but intrigued. "Next step? What do you mean?" Alex leaned forward, lowering his voice as if he were about to share a secret. "The thing is, Marcus, you've come so far because you've learned how to think, how to approach challenges with clarity and purpose. But there's another side to this journey. You can't just apply the same mentality to everything in life, especially when it comes to the decisions you're about to face. There are bigger questions now. Questions that go beyond the realm of what you've been learning." Marcus' confusion deepened. "What kind of questions?" Alex paused, staring out the window for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more introspective. "You're standing on the edge of something. You've achieved more than you thought possible, and now, you'll have to decide what kind of person you want to become. You'll be faced with opportunities and temptations that could change your path in ways you can't yet imagine. You'll have to decide how much of yourself you're willing to give up for success. And if you're not careful, you could lose sight of the very thing that made you strong in the first place." Marcus was silent, absorbing Alex's words. They felt like a warning, but also a challenge. A choice. Alex's gaze met his. "Success can be a powerful thing, Marcus. But the real question is, what does it cost? Are you willing to pay the price?" The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and Marcus felt a sudden wave of uncertainty. For the first time in weeks, he was unsure of where his journey would take him. "I don't know if I understand," Marcus said, his voice quiet. Alex's expression softened slightly. "It's not a simple answer. It's a question you'll have to ask yourself when the time comes. Right now, I'm giving you the chance to grow, to build on what you've started. But soon, you'll be at a crossroads. You'll need to decide what path you want to take." The gravity of the conversation started to sink in, and Marcus felt a knot tighten in his chest. This was no longer just about succeeding in school or mastering his abilities. It was about something deeper, something more personal. Alex stood up, leaving a few bills on the table for their coffee. "I'm not going to tell you what to do, Marcus. But I will tell you this, the choices you make in the coming months will define the rest of your life. How you handle them, how you balance success with who you are, will determine everything." He gave Marcus a final, intense look. "You're on the verge of something important, Marcus. Don't lose yourself in the process." Marcus stared at him, unable to find the words. The weight of Alex's warning pressed on him like a heavy burden. It was as though the world had suddenly become a much more complicated place. The idea of success, of achieving greatness, no longer seemed as simple as it once had. As Marcus walked out of the cafe, his mind was spinning. The sense of uncertainty that Alex had instilled in him gnawed at his thoughts. How far was he willing to go? What was he willing to sacrifice? Alex had opened his eyes to something Marcus hadn't considered. Success wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about the choices you made along the way, the sacrifices you were willing to accept, and how much of yourself you were prepared to lose in pursuit of your goals. The idea of success, once a simple concept, had now become something complicated, layered with questions Marcus wasn't sure he was ready to answer. He had come so far. But now, it seemed that the hardest part was yet to come. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming, something that would change the course of his life forever. Alex's words lingered in his mind, constantly resurfacing whenever he thought about the future. What was success? And more importantly, what was it going to cost him? His once clear vision of what he wanted to achieve had started to blur. The ideas that had driven him forward, proving himself, overcoming his doubts, and becoming the best version of himself, were still there, but now they seemed intertwined with something darker. What if success wasn't worth the price? What if the sacrifices Alex warned him about were too great to bear? It was a Thursday afternoon when Marcus received the unexpected invitation. It came through a text, no more than a brief line. "We need to talk. It's about an opportunity. Meet me at the old library. I'll explain everything." The message was from Greg, a classmate who had always been in the background of Marcus's life. They weren't close, but Greg had recently made waves in the school, earning the attention of the principal and a few of the more influential teachers. Greg was one of those students who always seemed to be in the right place at the right time, and recently, Marcus had been hearing whispers about his growing influence in the academic world. Marcus's mind raced as he thought about the invitation. The old library had been abandoned for years. It was a place that didn't hold any particular significance to him, but it was known to be a space where a few students with ambition gathered, working on projects or talking about opportunities that were beyond the normal scope of school activities. Greg's message was clear: this was something that Marcus needed to consider. As Marcus arrived at the old library, he hesitated for a moment before pushing the creaky door open. The building smelled of dust and old paper. The shelves were nearly empty, save for a few forgotten books. It was as if the library itself had been left behind in time. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. In the far corner of the room, Greg sat, his figure partially obscured by a stack of books. As Marcus approached, Greg looked up, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Glad you could make it," Greg said, his tone smooth, almost rehearsed. Marcus gave a small nod, trying to mask the unease he felt. "What's this about, Greg? You said you had an opportunity for me." Greg leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with a sort of confidence Marcus hadn't seen before. "It's not just an opportunity, Marcus. It's the chance of a lifetime." He gestured toward the large, dusty book on the table in front of him. "This," Greg continued, "is what they don't teach you in school. The real path to success. You know how you've been working hard, making a name for yourself. Well, there's a whole world out there where people like you can go farther, much farther, than anyone would expect." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Greg's smile widened. "I'm talking about an exclusive network. People who have influence. Who can get you into the most prestigious circles. People who have the connections and the resources to make you a success, not just in academics but in life. We're talking big names, big money, big opportunities." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. This was sounding more and more like a sales pitch for something he didn't quite understand. "You want me to join some kind of club?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Greg chuckled. "Not a club. This isn't a social gathering. This is power. And you can have it all, Marcus. You just have to be willing to take that first step." Marcus took a step back, trying to make sense of Greg's words. "And what's the catch?" Greg's eyes gleamed with excitement. "The catch? There's no catch. It's all about taking advantage of the opportunities you're given. There's a group of people who are always looking for someone like you, someone with intelligence, potential, and drive. All you have to do is prove yourself. The rest? It's easy. Trust me." Marcus's mind spun as he listened. Part of him felt a deep, instinctive caution. This felt wrong. But another part of him, the part that had been struggling to find his place in the world, felt the allure of Greg's words. Was this the shortcut to success? The one Alex had warned him about? Was this the test of his integrity that Alex had said he would face? Greg seemed to read Marcus's hesitation. Look, I'm not saying you have to jump in right now. But think about it. You've worked hard. You've proven yourself. You don't have to fight for scraps anymore, Marcus. You can be at the top of the food chain. You just have to be willing to take the leap. There was silence for a moment. Marcus's heart was pounding in his chest as he thought about Greg's offer. The temptation was powerful. This was the kind of thing that could change everything. It could give him everything he'd ever wanted: fame, success, influence. It could set him on a path where he no longer had to struggle, no longer had to fight against the odds. But at what cost? That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, the weight of the decision pressing on his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about Greg's offer and the world he had painted so vividly. Everything Marcus had worked for, everything Alex had taught him, seemed to be standing at a crossroads. He had learned how to think through problems, how to approach challenges with clarity. But this was different. This was a moral decision. As the hours passed, Marcus realized that the decision he was about to make wasn't just about success. It was about who he wanted to become. Would he be the person who climbed the ladder at any cost, willing to bend the rules, to sacrifice his values for the sake of achievement? Or would he stand firm, knowing that true success came from hard work, integrity, and doing things the right way? The thought of betraying everything Alex had taught him felt like a betrayal to himself. But the temptation was still there, lurking in the shadows of his mind. The next morning, Marcus stood before the mirror once again. This time, it wasn't about preparing for a test. It was about preparing for something far more important, the decision that would define his future. Would he take the leap? Or would he choose a different path, one that aligned with who he truly wanted to be? The next few days passed in a blur. Marcus went through the motions of school, pretending like everything was normal, but his mind was a storm of uncertainty. The offer Greg had made was still on his mind, gnawing at him every waking moment. He knew that the longer he delayed making a decision, the more it would eat away at him. But how could he choose? Both paths seemed like they held the key to his future, yet they each represented something entirely different. At school, he was still surrounded by his usual routine, but his thoughts were never far from Greg's words. He passed his classmates in the halls, saw the familiar faces, but it was like everything was happening in a haze. Even his conversations with his friends felt distant. He could no longer connect with them in the same way. They were living in a different world, a world where choices like Greg's offer weren't on the table. And Marcus realized with a start that he no longer knew which world he truly belonged to. Alex had said the coming months would be a test. But Marcus didn't realize how much he would need to confront within himself. This was bigger than solving a difficult math problem. This was about who he was and who he wanted to become. He could no longer ignore the weight of the decision ahead. One evening, after another day of feeling disconnected, Marcus found himself standing outside Alex's apartment building. He hadn't spoken to Alex in days. There was so much he needed to ask, so much that he wasn't sure how to process on his own. Maybe Alex could give him clarity, or at the very least, help him find a way to understand the choice he was facing. He rang the bell, his nerves on edge as he waited for the door to open. Alex appeared moments later, looking surprised but not completely caught off guard. "Marcus, you okay?" Alex asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." Marcus let out a long breath, feeling the tension in his body ease just a little. "I've been thinking a lot about everything you said," he admitted, stepping inside when Alex motioned for him to enter. "Everything?" Alex asked, offering him a seat on the couch. "What's going on?" Marcus sat down, trying to collect his thoughts. He had no idea where to begin. Finally, he just let it spill out. "I got an offer from Greg. He's part of some kind of group, I think. He says it's the chance to make a name for myself, to really get ahead. He said it's a shortcut to success, no more struggling, no more waiting. Alex sat down across from him, his expression unreadable. I see. And you're considering it? Marcus nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know what to think anymore. He says it's all about influence, connections, resources, power. It's everything I've ever wanted, but it feels wrong. Alex didn't rush to speak. He sat there for a moment, his hands clasped in his lap as he thought. Finally, he looked Marcus in the eye. You're right to feel conflicted, Alex said softly. Because that's the choice you're facing right now. It's not a simple one. The temptation of success without struggle, it's powerful. It promises an easier path, but it's one that comes with a cost. You may get everything you've ever wanted, but you'll lose something valuable in the process. Marcus swallowed hard, the weight of Alex's words settling deep in his chest. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can give up everything I've learned. I've worked so hard to get where I am, and now I'm supposed to just throw it all away for something that might not even be real. Alex leaned forward, his voice firm. The thing about success, Marcus, is that it's different for everyone. The world will always offer you shortcuts, ways to get ahead faster, but those paths are never without consequences. And you can't rely on anyone else's definition of success, you have to create your own. The moment you start letting someone else tell you what you need, you risk losing sight of who you really are. Marcus sat back, absorbing Alex's words. It was hard to hear, but it also felt like the truth. He had come so far because he had chosen to work for what he had. But now, there was an easier path in front of him, one that promised everything, if he was willing to compromise. Do you think Greg's offer is real? Marcus asked quietly. Or is it just a lie? Alex shook his head slowly. I don't know Greg well enough to say. But what I do know is this: any offer that promises easy success without any real effort is bound to come with strings attached. Nothing comes for free, Marcus. Not really. The world might tell you that shortcuts are the answer, but the truth is that the real victory is in the struggle itself. It's in proving to yourself that you can rise to the challenge, no matter how hard it is. Marcus looked at Alex, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had spent so long believing that success was the ultimate goal, but now, for the first time, he was beginning to understand that there was more to it than just reaching the top. The climb mattered too. The journey mattered. I want to be successful, Alex, Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. But I don't want to lose who I am along the way. Alex smiled, a rare moment of warmth breaking through his usual stoic exterior. Then don't. You get to choose, Marcus. It's your path. And no one can take that from you unless you let them. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, his thoughts were clearer than they had been in days. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't be the kind of person who sacrificed his values just to succeed. Success, true success, would come when he stayed true to himself, even if the path was harder. The decision, it seemed, had already been made. The days that followed Marcus's conversation with Alex felt like a slow build-up to something inevitable. Despite the clarity that had come from talking to his friend, Marcus couldn't escape the nagging feeling that the temptation was still out there, waiting to pull him in. It wasn't that he didn't believe in Alex's advice. In fact, he knew deep down that Alex was right. But temptation wasn't always about reason, it was about desire. And Marcus found himself constantly battling the desire for an easier, more glamorous path. As the week progressed, Greg kept reaching out. His messages became more urgent, more insistent. Each one was a reminder of the opportunity Marcus was turning down, each word designed to entice him. You've got what it takes, Greg's texts read. Why struggle when you can have it all? The messages were subtle but persistent, like a seed planted in Marcus's mind, growing into a temptation he couldn't fully shake off. It wasn't long before Marcus found himself in a place he hadn't expected. He was sitting in the cafeteria, surrounded by his usual group of friends, but his thoughts were a million miles away. He didn't even hear them talking about the latest school gossip. His mind kept drifting back to that conversation in the old library with Greg, back to the idea of belonging to a world where things were easier, where success wasn't earned through blood, sweat, and tears but rather handed to you on a silver platter. And then, like clockwork, Greg appeared. He didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he lingered by Marcus's table, waiting for a moment when their eyes met. As if sensing the tension, the unease, Greg smiled confidently, then walked over. "Marcus," he said casually, as though he hadn't been bombarding him with messages for days. "We really need to talk. Let's go somewhere quiet." The casualness of the invitation felt different this time. It wasn't just about the opportunity anymore. It was about making Marcus feel like he was missing out, like there was something important he hadn't fully understood. Greg's charm was undeniable, and it was beginning to wear Marcus down. "All right," Marcus said, standing up, trying to keep his voice steady. "Let's talk." They walked together through the halls of the school, passing by classrooms and empty lockers, until they reached an empty corner of the schoolyard. There, away from the eyes of teachers and classmates, Greg stopped and turned to face Marcus. "Look," Greg began, his tone suddenly serious. "I get it. You're not sure. You think this offer is too good to be true. But you need to understand something. This isn't just about power. It's about freedom. You don't have to work twice as hard to get half the results. You're too talented to be stuck in a system that doesn't appreciate your worth." Marcus felt the pressure mounting in his chest. He knew Greg was playing on his insecurities, on his hunger for validation. But it was working. The idea of freedom, of a shortcut, was seductive. "I know what I'm offering you isn't easy to accept," Greg continued, a note of urgency creeping into his voice. "But this is your moment, Marcus. You can't keep waiting for permission. You're on the verge of something big, and you don't want to be the guy who looks back and wonders what might have been." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His mind was a mess. There was a part of him that could feel the pull of this new world Greg was offering him, a world where success wasn't earned through effort and hard work but simply given to those who were willing to seize it. But then, Marcus thought of Alex, and of everything he had learned. The lesson was clear: success without integrity was empty. Success without effort was hollow. "Greg," Marcus said, his voice firmer now, "I appreciate the offer. I really do. But this isn't the way I want to go. I'm not willing to sell out to get ahead. I've got my own path, and I'm going to walk it, even if it's harder. Even if it means I'll struggle. It's my choice." Greg's smile faltered for just a second, but he quickly recovered, his face becoming neutral. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low, almost threatening. "You'll see. When you realize how much you've given up for some misplaced sense of pride, you'll wish you'd taken the chance." Marcus stood there, his heart racing, but he didn't waver. "Maybe," he said. "But I'd rather regret a decision I made than one I was forced into." There was a long pause, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Greg looked at Marcus as if evaluating him, sizing him up one last time. Finally, he shrugged. "Fine," Greg said, his voice cold now. "But don't say I didn't warn you. Not everyone gets a second chance." With that, Greg turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone in the quiet corner of the schoolyard. The weight of the decision settled in his chest, but this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt right. The next few days passed in a blur of emotions. Marcus couldn't escape the ripple effects of his decision. There were whispers in the halls, glances from classmates who had once seen him as part of the in crowd, but who now regarded him with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Some students came to him, offering sympathy, others with barely hidden disdain. But Marcus didn't let it get to him. When he walked into school the following Monday, there was a shift in the air. He no longer felt like he was part of something larger, something glamorous and powerful. Instead, he felt like an outsider, someone who had chosen a path less traveled, and it was harder than he had imagined. But there was a part of him that knew, deep down, that this was where he was meant to be. The struggle, the uncertainty, it was all part of the process. And Marcus was ready to face it. As he sat down in his first class of the day, he found his mind clearer than it had been in weeks. He wasn't chasing someone else's version of success anymore. He was chasing his own. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a sense of peace. The weeks following Marcus's decision to reject Greg's offer were harder than he had expected. It wasn't the constant temptation of a seemingly easy path that bothered him, it was the silent, insidious pressure that came from being labeled as different. At school, things had begun to shift in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. His peers had noticed his rejection of Greg's world and, for the first time, he found himself standing at the edges of his social circle. No longer was he the golden boy, the one who seemed destined for something greater. Now, he was the one who had chosen the hard road, the one who had turned down power for principles. Some students congratulated him, saying they admired his decision, while others seemed to avoid him altogether. There were whispers that followed him through the hallways, rumors that he had turned down the offer because he wasn't good enough, or worse, because he was afraid. But the real challenge wasn't in the judgment of others, it was in the struggle within himself. Marcus had told Greg he would rather take the harder road, but he couldn't help but question whether he had made the right choice. Would his decision come back to haunt him? Was there a way to keep moving forward without regretting his path? One chilly afternoon, Marcus was sitting in the school library, trying to focus on an essay he had to write for English class. His mind, however, kept drifting back to the conversations he had had with Greg, and the whispered words from his classmates. He was still in the process of navigating his place in this new reality. It felt like a battle, fighting the urge to slip into old habits and routines that would offer him the illusion of success without the effort, while also trying to remain true to the values he had set for himself. As he sat there, staring blankly at the page, the sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He glanced up and saw a figure standing at the end of the aisle of books. It was Emily, his old friend who had always been by his side, even when things got complicated. She had been quiet about his decision, but Marcus could see the concern in her eyes. "Hey, Marcus," she said softly, approaching the table. "Mind if I sit?" He gestured to the empty seat across from him, and Emily sat down, looking at him with an unreadable expression. They hadn't spoken much since his decision to turn down Greg's offer. Marcus wasn't sure if she was supportive, skeptical, or if she was simply trying to figure out where they stood now. "How are you holding up?" Emily asked, her voice gentle but filled with curiosity. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I don't know. I mean, it's harder than I thought. I thought that making the choice would feel like a victory, but now I just feel isolated. Like I'm stuck between two worlds." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes understanding. "I get that. It's like you don't fit in with your old crowd, but you also don't feel like you belong in the other world either. You've made a choice that's hard, and it's not going to be easy. People will talk, and they'll judge you, but that's what happens when you do something that challenges the norm. You're breaking away from the mold." Marcus looked at her, his gaze searching her face for any sign of judgment. But there was none. Emily's expression was one of quiet support, something he hadn't realized he needed until now. "I'm just scared," he admitted, his voice softer than he had intended. "What if I made the wrong choice? What if the price for staying true to myself is too high? I could have had everything, Emily, power, influence, respect. I could have had all of that, and yet I chose this path. But I'm not even sure what I'm really working for anymore." Emily leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense but filled with empathy. "Marcus, I know it feels like the hardest thing in the world right now. But you have to trust yourself. What you're doing isn't just about rejecting Greg or his offer. It's about defining who you are, not letting anyone else dictate your life. You're stronger than you think, and I know you're doing the right thing, even if it doesn't feel like it right now. Marcus stared at her, her words sinking deep into his mind. He had heard similar things before, but something about hearing them from Emily, someone who had always been by his side, made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this after all. "But what if I don't make it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if the world I'm fighting for isn't enough?" Emily reached across the table, placing a hand over his. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. "The world you're fighting for is the one you want to build, Marcus. Not everyone will understand that, but the ones who matter, the ones who truly care about you, will be there. Success isn't always measured by how much power you have. It's measured by how much you stay true to yourself. And you're doing that." Marcus's heart swelled with gratitude. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. The weight of the decision still pressed on him, but Emily's words had given him a new perspective. Maybe he didn't need to have everything figured out right away. Maybe it was okay to take it one step at a time. As the days passed, Marcus began to realize that the true challenge wasn't about achieving success or gaining recognition, it was about staying grounded, no matter how hard it got. The world would always try to pull him in different directions, but Marcus had to decide where he wanted to stand. He couldn't let fear or uncertainty cloud his vision. His choice had been difficult, yes, but it had been his. And that, in itself, was something no one could take away from him. Still, as he navigated this uncharted territory, Marcus knew that the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The following weeks were a series of quiet battles. On the surface, Marcus had returned to his routine, continuing his schoolwork, spending time with Alex, and trying to stay focused on the long-term goals he had set for himself. But beneath it all, the internal conflict continued to simmer. Every day, there was a new challenge, a new test of his resolve. It wasn't that Greg had given up on trying to pull Marcus into his world. Quite the opposite, Greg was relentless. Marcus had expected as much. The messages came more frequently, each one more persuasive than the last. "You've got potential," Greg would say. "Why waste it on playing by their rules?" Greg's messages weren't the only pressure Marcus was dealing with. The whispers in the halls had grown louder, more mocking. His classmates, the ones who had once treated him with reverence, now viewed him with a mixture of pity and disbelief. There were the snide comments, the condescending glances, the mockery of his decision. And worse, there were the ones who didn't even bother pretending to care anymore. One afternoon, Marcus sat in the library, staring at the pages of his history textbook without really reading them. The words blurred together, as they often did when his mind was preoccupied. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, seeing a message from Greg: "This is your last chance. Once you realize you've wasted your time, it will be too late. Don't make a mistake you can't undo." Marcus stared at the screen for a long moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He thought about responding, about making his final stance clear. But what was the point? Greg wasn't the type of person who listened to reason, and a part of Marcus knew that no matter how many times he rejected him, Greg would always come back. With a deep sigh, Marcus put the phone down and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. It felt like the world was closing in on him, and he couldn't escape it. Not even the small victories, like his recent triumph in his calculus exam, or the way his teachers had started to notice his improvement in class, could provide the satisfaction they once would have. They felt hollow, almost meaningless in the face of everything else. It was the following week that things came to a head. It started with a meeting in the principal's office, a routine check-in, or so it seemed. Marcus had been summoned to discuss his recent performance and his future at the school. Principal Harris was sitting at his desk when Marcus entered, his usual stern expression softened by a hint of concern. "Marcus, I've been reviewing your progress over the last few months, and I wanted to have a conversation with you." Marcus sat down, his stomach tightening. He had a feeling where this was going. I've heard some things, Principal Harris continued, looking up from the papers on his desk. About your choices, about your decision to distance yourself from certain groups, particularly Greg's. I just want to make sure you're making the right choice here. We both know that the path you've chosen isn't the easiest one. Marcus swallowed hard, nodding. He had expected this conversation to come eventually, but hearing it aloud felt different. It felt real. I know what you're going through, Principal Harris said, leaning forward. But you also need to understand that sometimes, we have to make sacrifices. The people you surround yourself with, they influence your future. I just want to make sure you're not closing doors for the wrong reasons. The words were careful, calculated. There was a certain underlying pressure in the principal's tone that made Marcus uncomfortable. It wasn't so much a direct threat, but more like an unspoken warning that if he didn't fall in line, he would be left behind. I'm not trying to shut doors, sir, Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm just choosing a different path. One that I think is more honest. The principal studied him for a moment, and Marcus could tell that he wasn't entirely convinced. I understand your desire to stick to your principles, Marcus. But I've been around long enough to know that sometimes, sticking to your principles comes at a cost. You can't always afford to be the good guy. Sometimes, you have to play the game if you want to get ahead. Marcus didn't reply right away. The weight of the principal's words pressed down on him, but he refused to let them sway him. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't give in, not now. He had made his decision, and no matter how difficult it was, he was going to stick to it. Thank you for your advice, sir, Marcus said finally. But I'm confident in my choices. There was a long silence before Principal Harris gave a slow nod, clearly not fully convinced but unwilling to push further. All right, Marcus. I just want you to be sure. The world can be a harsh place for someone who isn't willing to play by the rules. The conversation with Principal Harris lingered in Marcus's mind for days afterward. He had expected a little pushback from the adults in his life, but this felt different. It wasn't just about being pressured by Greg and his classmates anymore. Now, even authority figures were subtly encouraging him to bend, to compromise, to give in. The constant barrage of challenges was starting to wear him down, but it wasn't just external forces that were making him question his decision. It was the internal struggle that threatened to undo everything he had worked for. What if they were right? What if his refusal to take shortcuts was holding him back? That evening, Marcus sat alone in his room, staring out the window into the darkening sky. He thought about his family, his parents, who had always encouraged him to do the right thing, to never compromise his integrity. He thought about Alex, who had stood by him every step of the way. But most of all, he thought about the person he wanted to be. It wasn't just about success. It was about knowing he could look at himself in the mirror every day and be proud of the man he was becoming. And maybe that was enough. Marcus had spent the past few days locked in a battle with his thoughts. The pressure was suffocating. Everyone around him seemed to want him to change. It wasn't just Greg, his classmates, or Principal Harris anymore, it was the whole world, silently whispering that success wasn't about doing the right thing, it was about playing the game, bending the rules, and taking shortcuts. His classmates had started to make comments again, more pointed and harsh than before. The rumors about him being too good for the real world spread like wildfire. They called him naive, foolish, and even a bit of a martyr. In a twisted way, it was almost like he had become the school's latest project, a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything that could go wrong when someone refused to play by the unspoken rules. But there was one voice that still echoed in his mind louder than all the others, Emily. She had said that doing the right thing would cost him, but it would also mean something in the end. At the time, Marcus had only half understood. He hadn't truly realized how much he would have to sacrifice until now. One afternoon, while walking to the library, Marcus was stopped by a familiar voice. It was Alex. His best friend since childhood had always been a steady presence in Marcus's life, someone he could count on no matter what. "Hey," Alex said, catching up with Marcus as he walked briskly through the halls. "Can we talk for a minute?" Marcus glanced over at his friend, who seemed unusually serious. "Sure. What's up?" Alex led him to an empty bench outside the school building, away from the bustle of the cafeteria and the noise of the hallways. They sat down, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Marcus could feel the tension building in the air, but he wasn't sure where this conversation was headed. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Alex began, his voice measured. "About you. About your decision." Marcus stiffened. "What about it?" "I'm not going to lie, Marcus," Alex continued, looking him square in the eye. "It's been hard to watch. I get it, you want to do the right thing, you want to stand by your principles. But I'm worried, man. I'm worried about you." Marcus frowned. "Worried about me? What do you mean?" Alex sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I'm your friend, Marcus. I care about you. But this thing you're doing, it's tearing you apart. I've seen it. You're not the same guy you used to be. You're always second-guessing yourself, always wondering if you made the right choice. It's starting to eat at you, and I'm afraid it's going to break you." Marcus's heart sank. He hadn't realized that his internal struggle was so visible. He had tried to keep his doubts hidden, to keep up the facade of confidence, but it was clear now that even Alex, his closest friend, could see the cracks. "I'm not trying to be perfect, Alex," Marcus said, his voice tight. "I just want to do the right thing. I'm not trying to be a hero or anything. I just want to be me." Alex shook his head. "But what does that even mean? You're pushing yourself to the limit, and for what? A moral high ground? A feeling that you're doing the right thing? Because let me tell you, Marcus, the world doesn't care about your morals. They care about results. They care about power, influence. They care about what you can give them." The words hit Marcus hard. He had heard them before, from Greg, from Principal Harris, but hearing them from Alex, someone who had always stood by him, felt different. Alex's words felt like a punch to the gut, an undeniable truth he couldn't ignore. "I'm not asking you to change who you are, Marcus," Alex said, his voice softer now. "I'm just asking you to think about the bigger picture. The world is tough. You have to be tough too, or it'll swallow you whole." There was a long silence as Marcus processed what Alex had said. It was hard to hear, but he knew deep down that his friend was right about one thing: the world wasn't kind to those who played by the rules. But was that really the kind of world he wanted to be a part of? "You're not wrong," Marcus said finally, his voice quiet. "But I don't know if I can be the person I want to be if I give in. If I take the easy road." Alex placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You don't have to give in. You don't have to become someone you're not. But you do have to figure out a way to make it work. I don't want to see you lose yourself, Marcus. Not over something like this." Marcus nodded slowly, the weight of his friend's words sinking in. It wasn't that Alex was asking him to abandon his principles, it was that he was challenging Marcus to find a way to navigate the harsh realities of life without losing himself in the process. The next day, Marcus found himself once again walking through the school hallways, but this time something had changed. The uncertainty, the fear, the self-doubt, they were still there, but they no longer controlled him. He had a clearer vision of what he needed to do. He didn't have to sacrifice his integrity, but he also couldn't keep living in isolation, fighting against a world that refused to change. In that moment, Marcus realized that the turning point wasn't about choosing between Greg's world and his own, it was about carving out a third path, one where he could stay true to himself but still play the game in his own way. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wouldn't come without its own set of challenges. But Marcus was ready to face them. Because, in the end, it wasn't about winning. It was about learning how to live authentically, even in a world that tried to force you into a mold. That afternoon, Marcus received another message from Greg. It was typical, another offer, another persuasive argument about the power Greg could offer him. But this time, Marcus didn't feel the need to respond. Instead, he turned his phone off and walked toward the school courtyard, where Alex was waiting for him. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he had a plan. And maybe that was enough. The final chapter arrived faster than Marcus had expected. He had been so consumed with the whirlwind of challenges, decisions, and constant inner battles that he had barely noticed how far he had come. It felt like the finish line was in sight, but instead of feeling relief, Marcus was filled with a sense of anticipation, because the hardest choice of all was still ahead of him. For the past few days, he had tried to focus on his schoolwork, his friendships, and everything that had seemed so important before Greg had shown up with his tempting offers. But the world around him still spun with its pressures. The messages from Greg had become less frequent, but more intense. I know you're scared. I know you're tempted by this simple life, but it's not enough. You're meant for more. Don't waste your potential. Join us, and you'll see how much more you can achieve. Marcus had read those words countless times, but each time they felt less convincing. He had thought about it, wrestled with the idea, and even considered how much simpler his life could be if he just gave in. But something inside him kept saying no. It wasn't just about his moral compass anymore, it was about finding peace with who he truly was. It was Friday morning when Marcus received the final challenge. He had been called to the principal's office once again. This time, it was for a meeting with both Principal Harris and Greg. As soon as he entered the office, Marcus could sense the tension in the air. Greg was sitting there, cool and composed as usual, with an almost smug look on his face. Marcus, Principal Harris began, his voice oddly smooth. I hope you're ready for a serious conversation. We've been discussing your future, and I think we all agree that you have incredible potential. But you need to understand the reality of the situation. You can't keep going the way you are and expect to succeed in this world. There are doors that are only open to those who are willing to take them. Greg leaned forward in his seat, the corners of his mouth curling into a confident grin. Marcus, this is your chance. Think about it. I've helped so many people just like you, people who were stuck, people who couldn't see the bigger picture. But you're different, Marcus. You have the intelligence, the drive. All you have to do is stop fighting us. Take that final step, and I'll make sure the world knows your name. You'll never have to struggle again. For the first time, Marcus felt a cold surge of anger rising within him. Greg's words, though persuasive, were empty. The promise of success and power that Greg dangled in front of him felt hollow. Marcus had learned something important in these past months. It wasn't about the destination, but the journey. And he wasn't going to compromise who he was to get to a destination that wasn't even worth reaching. He took a deep breath, his hands resting firmly on the desk in front of him. I'm not going to do it, Marcus said, his voice calm but resolute. I know what you're offering, and I know what you want me to become. But I'm not that person. I won't sacrifice my integrity for power, and I won't let anyone tell me who I should be. Greg's smile faltered for just a second before he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. You're making a mistake, Marcus. A huge mistake. Principal Harris remained silent, observing the exchange with a look of quiet disappointment. I understand your position, Marcus, he said after a long pause. But understand this, you can't have both. You can't hold on to your principles and expect to succeed in a world that doesn't care about them. You'll be left behind, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself. Marcus felt a pang of doubt, but it was fleeting. He had already made his choice. He had made peace with it. I don't need to play by your rules to succeed, he said firmly. And I don't need your approval. I know who I am, and I'm not going to change for anyone. For a moment, there was silence. The room felt thick with tension, but Marcus didn't back down. He knew the consequences of his decision, but he was finally free from the weight of doubt that had clouded his judgment. Walking out of the principal's office, Marcus felt lighter than he had in weeks. The world outside seemed different, less heavy, as if a fog had lifted. He didn't know what would happen next, if Greg would continue his campaign to pull him into his world, or if his classmates would start to rally against him. But it didn't matter. Marcus had taken a stand, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his own story. When he met Alex later that afternoon, his friend immediately noticed the change. "So, how did it go?" Alex asked, his voice cautious but hopeful. "I'm done," Marcus said, smiling for the first time in days. "I've made my choice, Alex. I'm going to keep doing things my way. And if it means being the underdog or not fitting in, then so be it." Alex grinned. "I knew you'd come around. I'm proud of you, man." Marcus grinned back, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. The journey had been difficult and the future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Marcus felt like he was heading in the right direction. In the weeks that followed, Marcus began to realize that success wasn't always about the big moments. It wasn't about proving others wrong or rising to the top by any means necessary. Success, for Marcus, was about living authentically, making choices that aligned with his values, and not letting anyone dictate who he was or what he could achieve. He started to focus even more on his studies, determined to show that intelligence and integrity weren't mutually exclusive. Slowly but surely, the people around him started to see the strength in his conviction. Some still mocked him, others still whispered behind his back, but many came to admire him for his unyielding resolve. And while Greg's world of influence and power seemed enticing to some, Marcus realized he didn't need it. He had something much more valuable, his sense of self. As graduation day approached, Marcus stood before his classmates, ready to take the next step. It wasn't about fitting in anymore, it was about forging his own path and finding peace with the person he had become. Marcus had learned a valuable lesson. The world would always try to push him in directions that didn't align with his values, but true success was about finding strength in one's integrity, even when the world seemed to reject it. And as Marcus walked out into the world beyond high school, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't just ready for what was next, he was prepared to face it on his own terms. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?